Hi, I'm Dr. Hans Tokke. Welcome to this City Insight. I'm coming today from Long Island City, Queens, where I live, looking across the East River to Manhattan, where you see the Empire State Building and the United Nations right behind me. From time to time, you'll hear helicopters flying over top of us on their way from Wall Street to LaGuardia Airport, taking commuting business people back home, or to the Gold Coast of Long Island. So if that interrupts along the way, at least you know I live in the city that has a lot of busyness to it. But welcome to this particular discussion of children living in poverty. It's presented as a mini lecture of Charter Oak State College students, but we welcome any comments from those who have something else to state. Indeed, on the discussion boards here, feel free to comment however you will and comment along the way on the video feed. In this particular session, I'm interacting with student comments as well as with my own, weaved through some theoretical ideas that I think fit well here. Books on youth poverty that form the background to our discussion are Jonathan Kozol's Fire in the Ashes and Robert Putnam's Our Kids, The American Dream. Again, books on youth poverty, Jonathan Kozol, Fire in the Ashes, Robert Putnam's Our Kids, The American Dream. The Children's Defense Fund says that 46.7 million people are living in poverty in the United States. As much as 1/3 of these are children. David, discussing ice cream being poor, remarked this way: I began to wonder what it was about me that I could not buy ice cream at lunch or a jungle juice at snack time. Of course, I eventually realized it was not about me, but about 9 children living under the same roof. But I think internalizing the why me about being poor can hurt children scholastically and socially. There is this thing about ice cream in the inner city. It's quite degrading having to listen to the dingle of the ice cream truck in the neighborhood and yet not being able to get an ice cream. Even though in the projects where most everyone is living fairly poor, there are degrees of poverty, those who can get an ice cream and those who cannot. For some, the sound of the softie truck, the celebration that summer is here, jingling down the street, is joy. For others, it's pain. It gets worse when one kid mocks the other and says, I got one, you can't have one. Ice cream in the inner city shows this inequality even in poverty. But in America, we have this idea of upward mobility. The possibility that we'll someday strike it rich ourselves is the good old American idea. America calls itself this classless society, yet the idea of upward mobility ensures there's always going to be an attempt to move up in class. The richer you get, the better you're off. Those of you who are poor, that's your plight. Maria commented this way: I feel that most low-income households share this idea of having the next generation do more, whereas a high-income family might just want their future generations to uphold the same high-achieving level they're at. In other words, some say, we're striving to get better. The others say, we're sustaining to keep what we have. So this ever-inducing struggle of inequality, the poor fight with those who want to keep their position of privilege. There is indeed this myth of upward mobility. One of the very real issues in the assumption of upward mobility is that not everybody can be upwardly mobile. Indeed, America has one of the fastest rising rates of inequality in the world between its richest and poorest. This myth lives out itself in this way. We tell a young African-American child, particularly a boy, you can play in the NBA, you can be anything you want yourself to be, which theoretically it's true, you can play in the NBA. But there's only a very small group that will ever play in the NBA. So it's a mythical idea. Or we can celebrate You can be the president of the United States, because we've seen a black president. Well, only one can be the black president. So this myth of upward mobility can become counterproductive to the poor when they realize, no way I'm going to get there. Indeed, in the New York City tri-state where here we stand, we have the largest Gini index in the United States. Across there at the UN, they measure the Gini index. What the Gini index demonstrates is the difference between the top 10% in a given society and the bottom 10%. In the Bridgeport-Stamford exurb of New York is the biggest difference between the richest and poorest in the United States. It has the highest Gini index between the richest and poorest in a small location in our country. So living within 20 miles of one another live some of the richest and poorest adjacent to one another. One group full of pride sustaining the American dream, the other striving to find the American dream amid their circumstances of poverty. In the towers behind me, you can't see it from here, it's around the other side of this building, but there's a new thin high-rise that is a good metaphor for this idea of inequality. 345 Park is the tallest building that's rising in our city, except for the tip of the Freedom Tower. It's also the most exclusive billionaire investors buying in to the condos in it. The penthouse was recently sold for $100 million. Being a thin building, it's come to represent three different social views: the cigar, the straw, the middle finger. The cigar for the roaring 20s, the wealthy cigar houses and the wealth celebrating away from everybody else. The straw, where we're sucking the global wealth into New York City to pay for our subways and our infrastructure and for our salaries. So yes, wealth from around the world come into our city. We like it because it pays for our infrastructure. To others, particularly the poor, it's the middle finger that says, I can never be rich, and I can certainly never achieve the wealth of those people living in the middle finger of New York. Well, how does this relate to children? Well, one Chinese woman apparently walked in with $5 million in cash and bought one of the lower, cheaper suites for her daughter for when the daughter would come to go to college. The daughter was apparently about 5 years old. So the child has this dorm room waiting for the next 20 years in the most exclusive residential building in New York City for 15 years from now. Meanwhile, parents of kids in impoverished neighborhoods in New York struggle to make rent. Jim Wallace in the book God's Politics comments that when our unprecedented growth exists alongside the embarrassing fact that 1 in 6 children is still poor and 1 in 3 children of color, the moral underpinnings of our prosperity are in great disarray. The post-World War II prosperity benefited most American families, but the prosperity of the 1990s sent a windfall straight to the very top, while leaving those at the very bottom even further behind and creating a new middle-class anxiety. He says that poor people are trapped because now we have record prosperity and rising inequality at the same time. The rising tide has lifted all the yachts. Indeed, the helicopters driving over top of me on their way to the Gold Coast of Long Island and its estate properties. Yet it's not lifted all the boats. But whose fault is this? Emerson has argued that some think it's the lazy butt syndrome. You're just too lazy to work, and that's why you're poor. Spencer, in the concept of social Darwinism, said that it's the survival of the fittest, and the survival of the fittest means that you're a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male in the 1850s, and thus you are most fit to serve and to rule, so those below you should subjugate themselves to you. Lewis, more modern, argues that it's a generational fatalism. Fatalism meaning I'm going to die here, and coins the term culture of poverty. Wilson says it's blame society, or us the people who don't create a social safety net strong enough to help those who need a hand. Some students have commented that really we need to invest more in poor kids and government help. Really, it's to blame society. The government and city officials' commentary is typical of the way we import this idea of blaming society and throw money at problems so things will change. Now, I do believe funding is an issue in some cases, but in other cases, there's a deeply embedded cultural way that makes it difficult to move into another way of life. Upper middle mobility is very difficult for some in the lower classes, for instance. And the tricky balance here is not that we move into dependency mode, which creates a whole nother element of social poverty problems. We don't just want to create a welfare ticket of government help. But yes, we do need to help those who are poor. The primary issues that we're going to address here fairly quickly, but they're much deeper than I could ever address in this environment, are the culture of poverty, the lack of education, and mental illness. First, the culture of poverty. One student said it this way, that it's really hard to stand up when everyone else is sitting down. Have you ever been in a movie theater where everyone's sitting down and a person stands up and it irritates everybody? Or you're sitting in a classroom and somebody stands up and walks in front of the professor and out the door to go to the bathroom or something. Well, it's really hard to stand up when everybody else is sitting down. You get embarrassed for doing this. But in the case of the movie theater, I have to go. Or in the classroom, I have to go. But what about a student that I interviewed as part of my doctoral work a number of years ago, who was a young African-American male, and he talked about how difficult it was moving into a middle-class neighborhood after having grown up in the projects. When he tried to go back home to the projects, he would be called an Uncle Tom or a white sellout. Why? Because you're no longer one of us here on the project. Everybody on the project had come to believe that everybody should stay the same. Meanwhile, we're having him moving into the middle class. This shows the element of the culture of poverty where it becomes enculturated to a way of life and someone doesn't know how to break free. And then they mock those who try to break free. It's hard when you're in the culture of poverty to come out of the community. So we have to deal with the root causes that cause the results of poverty. And these are not simple things to undo when poverty is enculturated as a way of life. Poverty affects the other issues of education and mental illness and many other outcomes such as homelessness, lack of a job, violence, depravity, all these issues that come to play when culture of poverty sticks at me and buries me. Chandra commented on this way. There's a lack of education, a failing education system, mental illness, substance abuse, and the abuse of power and corruption in our social system. And this cycles down generationally. Chandra is exactly right. And the idea that these social conditions cycle themselves down and embed themselves deeply that someone can't break free. Oscar Lewis coined the term culture of poverty, as I mentioned, and his concept shows that it becomes a way of life that no one can break free, no matter how strong the social helps built around them are, or how much they get offered. It's illustrated well in the movie God Bless the Child, where Mayor Winningham, after acting out this role of bringing her rural child into the city to try and make it together. After having gone through the homeless shelters, through the social services, trying to find schooling for her daughter, it's coming out as a real failure. And so she approaches the social worker and says, "My mama been poor, my papa been poor, we always been poor. My dad got a diabetes, but I can go back." And she creates a strategy for abandoning her daughter in the park so social services at least can pick up her daughter. And so the abandonment of children in some of our neighborhoods are like this. Because why? The culture of poverty is so embedded that they can't break free, that they have to find some way to abandon their child. Claudia comments on the examples of Eric and Pietro in the readings of Kozel and Putnam, and I think they're apropos. She shows how Eric and Pietro have a lack of education because in both stories, people do not have the opportunity of studying and becoming professionals. She also noted that Eric and Pietro have a lack of values, like the desire for progress or a better future. You see this embeddedness of defeat, fatalism. It looks like they got resigned to live in these conditions. Well, this brings us to education. Catherine remarks on education. A Casey comment that says, "Parents with at least a bachelor's degree have far more money on average to invest in their children's enrichment through books, tutors, music and dance lessons, sports, museums, and other educational activities than parents with only a high school diploma." So this is true. However, in these days, with more and more people having college degrees, it doesn't carry the same cachet it used to at one time that guarantees upward mobility. And it's shifted from being a scarce, pedigreed position having a bachelor's degree to a common required role for a basic job. So the kid from the inner city or the poor kid living in rural areas who can't break out of poverty, they don't have a good chance at getting a job. Education now becomes the calling card for even getting a good job. C. Wright Mills in The Power Elite says this: "As a selection and training place of the upper classes, both old and new, the private school is the unifying influence, a force for the nationalization of the upper classes." Some believe in this idea of upper class or suburban education, that being in a suburban school is much better than an inner city school. This is surely true to some degree. However, education is not a guarantee, but social conditions that are made are also valuable. Though education is certainly important, the networks one builds on the job hunting game are also crucial, especially in this day when many have college degrees. So one could make the comparison that the inequality between suburban and urban education, though they're inner city and specialized charter schools that break this stereotype, that really in the inner city where you don't have the privilege of the networks of suburban education, you're going to have a harder time to make it. Now those in the city who go to more privileged schools, they build these networks and can rise out of poverty. Similarly, in rural areas, those who go to impoverished rural schools don't make the networks where they can move out of it. While the movement of poverty to the suburbs, as we noted earlier with the Bridgeport-Stanford case, shows that the stereotypical idea of suburban schools being the network to better jobs isn't necessarily as true as it's always been. Which begs the question, is education an upward mobility guarantee? One student said this: "I think that if parents stress the importance of education to kids, they're more likely to succeed than those who don't. It's important that parents motivate their kids. Even if the parents aren't successful, the kids can be successful with the right support." This is true. I've had many students where the kids are the first to go to college. But while this might be theoretically true, the equal opportunity gap argument shows that how education alone doesn't create the social connections and networks into high-paying jobs and more stable jobs. Hiring into many positions is based on these kind of networks that you make. So this is not to degrade education per se, but education in the upper classes, combined with networks, gives and provides an easier slide into higher paying jobs than might be possible for someone in the lower classes. So what we see in Connecticut is an influx of the poor who are being pushed out of neighborhoods like mine into the core of the outer suburbs and the exurbs. The poor have to go somewhere, and they're migrating to these small clustered communities like Greenwich, Connecticut, Hudson Valley, Newburgh, and Haverstraw. In these regions, they seek the service jobs that are adjacent to the Tony suburbs. Landscapers, housekeepers, maintenance people, nannies, they're all finding these service jobs that are being paid for by the wealthy. But a strong driver of undocumented immigrants is they are also, with their language issues, being driven to the suburbs. They're not living in places like this in Manhattan. It's too pricey. They can't stay here. They can take care of those in other places. What's interesting about this is we're noticing a real clustering now of neighborhoods in the suburbs where the poor hang together, take care of each other's kids, and possibly give more care for children than you might get even in a city. A good example of a cluster like this is Brewster, New York. So we see then this shift between urban and suburban. So the suburban shell of privilege, though still there, has now been challenged. Some blame the problem of education because there's a lack of funds. I'm not sure this is wholeheartedly true, because what we're seeing is not the shifting of funds away from schools, but shifting towards STEM fields and much larger compliance assessment and evaluation of infrastructure. Indeed, this is a behemoth financially, based often on political outcomes. Also, we're seeing the boomer teachers who are tenured for many years now collecting very large salaries and pensions that might not be affordable to our school system. For instance, I was looking at some of these records and noticed that the top teacher in New York City in an inner city school makes $107,000 salary a year. This is expensive. So it's not that there's a loss of funding, but that there's never enough for all of this. But it brings us now to the poverty family. Add the poverty problem and the tension and pressure on the single mother. It's true that in some poor communities there is this stronger sense of community, of taking care of others that you'd get in these suburban clusters than in the individualistic and private worlds of the middle and upper class. The danger here, though, in clustering these small communities is it can revert back to the culture of poverty, learning the skills of staying poor and how to be poor. Mental health then becomes an issue because the impact of poverty can be seen in the social development of the children, as Judith says. Lucy says, I think knowing you are poor and not as well off as the others can make you very negative, and it can impact your social and environmental state. And so the stresses of poverty encircle the emotional being as the environment shifts their belief about themselves. Mead, in the social construction of self, talks about this into the degree that people cannot believe anything about themselves as they truly are as a person. They can't envision anything else but their current situation. So education isn't going to pull you out of a mental health position where you're believing yourself that you're poor and you can't get out of it. So there is this definition of the situation where people define who they are based on social environments and surroundings. Charles Cooley, in The Looking Glass Self, says that we have a problem lens, or a lens like this that we look through. When I look through these glasses, things are much clearer when I put them on. They're much blurrier when I take them off. Indeed, Manhattan, lights coming on now, is looking quite pretty, isn't it, folks? It's blue tonight, the Empire State Building. But if I take my glasses off, it doesn't look quite as nice. To you, when I put it behind my glasses, you can see the look of Manhattan through my glasses. So people have these looking glass self idea where they view their world through a certain lens. And if the lens is poverty, this makes it a real problem for them to rise out of this situation. Education isn't going to do it. Graves argues in his Spiral Dynamics that up to 70% of an at-risk personality can be formed from an extreme personality problem environment. So in the end, where are we with this? The culture of poverty is deeply embedded in the community. Education can be a way to help people rise out, and we hope it does. But I think Okisha summarizes it well. She says this: poverty is eroding the future of youths, and they'll continue to pay the price as a result if the society doesn't do more to help these urban youths. I think it's high time for you and I to think seriously about how through education and through help, we can help children rise out of the culture of poverty. I'm Dr. Hans Tokke. See you next time on A City Insight.